If the tribunal please, before going on further with the prepared manuscript, Your Honors properly ask a question or two about documents 3051 and 3063, which I think I have an answer that will help the tribunal. Your Honors will recall, with reference to document 3051, P.S., I believe it might be of assistance to turn to that document.
Yes.
Your Honors asked yesterday afternoon, since this had to do with the SD and the SS, how the party was involved. And I should like to quote paragraph numbered 1 on page 2 of the English translation, which answers this question. Paragraph numbered 1 on page number 2 of the English translation. Quoting, "The chiefs of the state police or their deputies must get in telephonic contact with the political leaders, Gauleitung oder Kreisleitung, who have jurisdiction over their districts, and have to arrange a joint meeting with the appropriate inspector or commander of the order police to discuss the organization of the demonstrations. At these discussions, the political leaders have to be informed that the German police has received from the Reichsführer SS and Chief of German Police the following instructions, in accordance with which the political leaders should adjust their own measures," unquote. Now that had to do with the preparation for the general Jewish uprisings. Now with reference to document 3063, which follows just one or two documents below,
One moment.
yes, sir.
What was the document?
3063 was the next one,
Yes.
just below that one, if Your Honor please.
Very well.
That, if you recall, Your Honor, was a report from the Supreme Court Justice Buch to the defendant Gehring concerning punishments for the uprisings that followed the 9th and 10th of November demonstrations. I should like to quote the portion signed by the defendant Gehring. It's on, I believe, the second page of the English translation. Dated Berlin, 22nd February 1939. Dear Party Member Buch, I thank you for forwarding the report of your special Senate about the procedure hitherto concluded concerning the excesses on the occasion of the anti-Jewish operations of 9-10 November 1938, of which I have taken cognizance. Heil Hitler, yours, Gehring. And then passing, Your Honor, to page numbered 1, immediately following of the English translation, I think the next two paragraphs will answer Your Honor's question. I quote, "On the evening of 9 November 1938, Reich Propaganda Director, Party Leader, Member, Dr. Goebbels, told the party leaders assembled at a social evening in the old town hall in Munich that in the districts, the Gau, of Kirchen and Magdeburg Anhalt, it had come to hostile Jewish demonstrations, during which Jewish shops were demolished and synagogues were set on fire. The Fuhrer, at Goebbels' suggestion, had decided that such demonstrations were not to be prepared or organized by the party, but so far as they originated spontaneously, they were not to be discouraged either. In other respects, party member Dr. Goebbels carried out the purport of what was prescribed in the teletype of the Reich Propaganda Administration of 10 November 1938. It was probably understood by all of the party leaders present.
What does 12:30 to 1 o'clock mean there?
That is the time of the teletype message, I assume, Your Honor.
Yes?
It was probably understood by all the party leaders present from the oral instructions of the Reich Propaganda Director that the party should not appear outwardly as the originator of the demonstrations, but in reality should organize and execute them. Instructions in this sense were telephoned immediately, thus a considerable time before transmission of the first teletype to the bureaus of their districts, GAL, by a large part of the party members present, unquote. Now, Your Honors properly asked yesterday afternoon how the block lighter would be affected. Your Honor will recall in the instructions to the block lighter or defining his offices, it was stated that his instructions would be received orally and they would be transmitted orally and never to use writing except in extreme cases. And therefore I say that these quoted portions clearly indicate that the party was in fact used in connection with these famous 9 and 10 November 1938 anti-Jewish demonstrations. Now, reverting back to the text where I left off yesterday afternoon, the leadership corps of the Nazi Party participated in the confiscation of church and religious property. I offer in evidence document 072 PS, which is U.S. Exhibit 357, which is a letter dated April 1941 from Reichsleiter Bormann to Reichsleiter Rosenberg. This letter exposes the participation of the Gauleiter in measures relating to the confiscation of religious property. I now quote from the last paragraph of page 1 of the English translation of document 072 PS, which reads, quote, "The libraries and art objects of the monasteries confiscated in the Reich were to remain for the time being in their monasteries insofar as the Gauleiter had not determined otherwise." End of quote. On 21 February 1940, the chief of the security police and SD Heydrich wrote a letter to Reichsfuhrer SS Himmler proposing that certain listed churches and monasteries be confiscated for the accommodation of so-called racial Germans. The tribunal, of course, will recall Himmler's position. After pointing out that on political grounds, outright expropriation of religious property would not be feasible at the time, Heydrich suggested certain specious interim actions with respect to the church properties in question to be followed progressively by outright confiscation. I now offer in evidence R101A. It's right towards the end of Your Honor's exhibit, as U.S. Exhibit 358. Your Honor, please, there are several of those documents under R101, and at the bottom you'll notice they're labeled A, B, and C. The first one is R101A. And I quote the first 5 paragraphs on page 2 of the English translation. Quoting, "Enclosed is a list of church possessions which might be available for the accommodation of racial Germans. The list, which please return, is supplemented by correspondence and illustrated material pertinent to the subject. For political reasons, expropriation without indemnity of the entire property of the churches and religious orders will hardly be possible at this time. Expropriation with indemnity or in return for assignment of other lands and grounds will be even less possible. It is therefore suggested that the respective authorities of the orders be instructed that they make available the monasteries concerned for the accommodation of racial Germans and remove their own members to other less populous monasteries." There's a marginal note opposite this paragraph that translated means very good. "The final expropriation of these properties thus placed at our disposal can then be carried out step by step in course of time." End of quotation. On 5 April 1940, the Security Police and Security Service of SS sent a letter to Reichskommissar for the Consolidation of Germandom, enclosing a copy of the foregoing letter from Heydrich to Himmler of 21 February 1940, proposing the confiscation of church properties. The letter of 5 April 1940 is included in the document R101A, just introduced in evidence. And I quote from the second sentence of the first paragraph thereof on page 1 of the English translation of document R101A. It's on the first paragraph of page 1 of that same document. Quoting, "The Reich leader SS has agreed to the proposals made in the enclosed letter and has ordered the matter to be dealt with by collaboration between the chief of the security police and security service and your office." Your Honor, please, I believe it's on page 1 of R101A. It's from the second sentence of the first paragraph on R101A.
This one here.
It's on the same one as the tab is, Your Honor.
Yes, I've got it.
I now offer in evidence document R101C. Exhibit 358. This is a letter dated July 30th, 1941, written by an SS Standartenführer whose signature is illegible to the Reich leader of the SS. The letter supplies further evidence of the participation of the Gauleiter in the seizure of church property. I quote from the first 3 paragraphs of the English translation of document R101C. 101C will be shown at the bottom of the page. Quoting, "Further to report of 30 May 1941, this office considers its duty to call the Reich leader's attention to the development which is currently taking place in the incorporated Eastern countries with regard to seizure and confiscation of church property. As soon as the Reich laws on expropriation had been introduced, the Reich governor and Gauleiter in the Warhurth land adopted the practice of expropriating real estate belonging to churches for use as dwellings. He grants compensation to the extent of the assessed value and pays the equivalent amount into blocked accounts. Moreover, the East German Estate Administration Limited reports that in Warth-Gau, all real estate owned by the churches is being claimed by the local Gau administration. End of quotation. I next offer in evidence document R-101D, which immediately follows. 358 U.S. Exhibit already in evidence. This is a letter from the Chief of Staff of the main office to Himmler, dated 30 March 1942, dealing with the confiscation of church property. The letter evidences the active participation of the party chancellery in the confiscation of religious property. In this letter, the Chief of Staff main office reports to Himmler concerning the policy of the SS in suspending all payments of rents to monasteries and other church institutions whose property had been expropriated. The letter discusses a proposal made by the Reich Minister of the Interior, in which the party chancellery prominently participated, to the effect that the church institutions should be paid amounts corresponding to current mortgage charges on the premises without realizing any profit. The writer further suggests that such payments should never be made directly to the ecclesiastical institutions, but should rather be made to the creditors of the institution. I now quote from the fourth sentence on page 3 of that document. Quoting, "Such an arrangement would be in line with the basic idea of the settlement originally worked out between the party chancellery and the Reich Minister of the Interior." End of quotation. And I understand the Reich Minister of Interior from 1933 to 1944 was the defendant Frick. The leadership corps of the Nazi Party participated in the suppression of religious publications and interfered with free religious education. In a letter dated 27 September 1940, Reichsleiter and Deputy of the Führer Bormann transmitted to the defendant Rosenberg a photostatic copy of a letter from Gauleiter Florian, dated 23 September 1940, which expresses the Gauleiter's intense disapproval on Nazi ideological grounds of a religious pamphlet entitled, quote, "The Spirit and Soul of the Soldiers," written by Major General von Rabenau. And I now offer in evidence document 064, P.S. 064, P.S. U.S. Exhibit 359. It's an original letter signed by Rosenberg attaching the copy of this pamphlet. It contains defendant Bormann's letter to Rosenberg dated 27 September 1940, transmitting the Gauleiter's letter of 23 September 1940 to the defendant Hess, in which the Gauleiter urges that the religious writings of General von Rabenau be suppressed. In his letter to the defendant Hess, Gauleiter Florian discusses a conversation he had with General Rabenau at the close of a lecture delivered by the general to a group of younger Army officers at Aachen. This conversation illumines the hostile attitude of the leadership corps of the Nazi Party towards the Christian churches. I quote from the second sentence of the second paragraph of the second page of the Gauleiter's letter to defendant Hess, which appears on page 2 of the English translation, the second paragraph. I quote, "After he had affirmed the necessity of the churches, Rabenau said, with emphasized self-assurance, something like the following: Dear Gauleiter, the party is making mistake after mistake in the business with the churches. Obtain for me the necessary powers from the Führer, and I guarantee that I shall succeed in a few months in establishing peace with the churches for all times. After this catastrophic ignorance, I gave up the conversation. Dear party member Hess, the reading of von Ravenau's pamphlet, Spirit and Soul of the Soldier, has reminded me again of this. In this brochure, Ravenau affirms the necessity of the church straightforward and clearly, even if it is prudently careful. He writes on page 28, there could be more examples. They would suffice to show that a soldier in this world can scarcely get along without thoughts about the next one. Because von Ravenau is falsely based spiritually, I consider his activities as an educator in spiritual affairs as dangerous. And I am of the opinion that his educational writings are to be dispensed with absolutely, and that the publication section of the NSDAP can and must renounce these writings. The churches with their Christianity are this danger against which the struggle must always be carried on. End of quotation. That the party chancellery shared with the Gauleiter hostility to the Christian churches is further revealed by Defendant Bormann's instruction to Defendant Rosenberg, set forth in Bormann's letter of transmittal, that Rosenberg take action on the Gauleiter's recommendation that the general's writings be suppressed. I now offer in evidence document 089 PS. 089 PS, U.S. Exhibit 360, which is a letter from Defendant Bormann as Deputy of the Fuhrer to Defendant Rosenberg, dated 8 March 1940, enclosing a copy of Bormann's letter of the same date to Reichsleiter Amann. Amann was a top member of the leadership corps by virtue of his position as Reichsleiter for the press and leader of the party publishing company. In this letter to Amann, Bormann expresses his dismay and dissatisfaction that only 10% of the 3,000 Protestant periodicals in Germany have ceased publication for what are described as, quote, paper-saving, unquote, reasons. Bormann then advises Reichsleiter Amann that, quote, the distribution of any paper whatsoever for such periodicals was barred. I now refer to this document, and I quote the second paragraph of Bormann's letter to Amann, which appears on the first page, second paragraph of the English translation. I quote, I urge you to see to it in any redistribution of paper to be considered later that the confessional writing, which according to experiences so far gathered possesses very doubtful value for strengthening the power of resistance of the people toward the external foe, receives still sharper restrictions in favor of literature, politically and ideologically more valuable. End of quotation. I next offer in evidence document 101 PS, U.S. Exhibit 361, which is a letter from the Defendant Bormann, again to Reichsleiter Rosenberg, dated the 17th of January, 1940, expressing the party's opposition to the circulation of religious literature to the members of the German armed forces. Among the soldiers of the United Nations, the proposition that there are no atheists in the foxholes received a wide and reverent acceptation. However, in this document, there's a contrary meaning, and I quote from page 1 of the English translation, which reads, quote, nearly all the districts, that is the Gau, report to me regularly that the churches of both confessions are administering spiritually to members of the armed forces. This administering finds its expression especially in the fact that soldiers are being sent religious publications by the spiritual leaders of the home congregation. These publications are in part very cleverly composed. I have repeated reports that these publications are being read by the troops and thereby exercise a certain influence on the morale. I have in the past sought, by sounding out General Field Marshal, the High Command of the Armed Forces, Reich Director Amen, to restrict considerably the production and shipment of publications of this type. The result of these efforts remains unsatisfactory. As Reichsleiter Amen has repeatedly informed me, the restriction of these pamphlets by means of the paper rationing has not been achieved because the paper is being purchased in the open market. If the influencing of the soldiers by the church is to be effectively combated, this will only be accomplished by producing many good publications in the shortest possible time under the supervision of the party. Thus, at the last meeting of the deputy Gauleiters, comments were uttered on this matter to the effect that a considerable quantity of such publications are not available. I maintain that it is necessary that in the near future we transmit to the party service offices down to the Ortsgruppenleiter a list of additional publications of this sort which would be sent to our soldiers by the Ortsgruppen. End of quotation. The Leadership Corps also participated in measures leading to the closing and dissolution of theological schools and other religious institutions. I now offer in evidence document 122 PS, U.S. Exhibit 362, which again is a letter from Defendant Bormann to Defendant Rosenberg. In his capacity as the Führer's representative for the supervision of spiritual and ideological schooling and education of the NSDAP. This letter is dated 17 April,
Number 122 PS.
number 122, and transmits to Rosenberg an enclosed photostatic copy of a plan suggested by the Reich Minister for Science, Education, and Training for the combining and closing of certain specially listed theological faculties. In his letter of transmittal, Defendant Bormann requested Reichsleiter Rosenberg to take cognizance and prompt action with respect to the proposed suppression of religious institutions. I now quote from next to the last paragraph on page 2 of the English translation, in which the plan to suppress the religious institutions is summarized and which reads, quoting, "To recapitulate this plan would include the complete closing of the theological faculties at Innsbruck, Salzburg, and Munich, and the transfer of the faculty of Graz to Vienna, and the vanishing of 4 Catholic faculties, closing of 3 Catholic theological faculties or higher schools, and 1 of 4 evangelical faculties in the winter semester of 39-40, closing of 1 further Catholic and of 3 further evangelical faculties in the near future," unquote. From the foregoing evidence, the inference is irresistible that the leadership corps of the Nazi Party shares in the responsibility for the measures taken to subvert the Christian churches and persecute the Christian clergy, both in Germany and in German-occupied territories of Europe. The evidence just offered, together with that previously presented by the prosecution, demonstrates that there was a general participation by the leadership corps, ranging from the Reichsleiter through the Gauleiter, adhered to by the rank and file in the deliberate program undertaken to undermine Christian religion, whose anti-Christian views are open and notorious, as the Führer's delegate or representative for the whole spiritual and philosophical education of the Nazi Party. It was precisely this position which gave Rosenberg his seat in the Reichsleitung, the general staff of the party composing all Reichsleiters. But emphasis is placed not merely upon the fact that antichrists such as defendants Bormann and Rosenberg held directive positions within the leadership corps, but upon the further fact that their directives and orders were passed down the chain of command of the leadership corps and caused the participation of its membership in acts subversive to the Christian church. In document number D75, which I believe has previously been introduced, and I'm just going to quote one line from it. The defendant Bormann stated, quote, "Nazism and Christianity are irreconcilable concepts. The defendant was never more right, but he erred grievously by his prophecy as to which of the two would first pass away." I next turn to the responsibility of the leadership corps for the destruction of free trade unions and the imposition of the conspiratorial control over the productive labor capacity of the German nation. The evidence relating to the responsibility of the Nazi conspirators for the destruction of the independent trade unions has been previously introduced in evidence as USA Exhibit G, which was the document book containing the evidentiary materials relating to the destruction of the trade union. The brief evidence which I shall now present is offered to prove the responsibility of the leadership corps of the Nazi Party for smashing of the independent unions and the imposition of conspiratorial control over the productive labor capacity of the German nation. Soon after seizure of power, prominent members of the leadership corps participated in the smashing and dissolution of the independent trade unions of Germany. The defendant Robert Lye, precisely by virtue of his office as Reich organization leader and Reichsleiter in the leadership corps, was directed by Hitler in mid-April 1939 to smash the independent unions. I now offer in evidence document 2283 PS. Which has been previously introduced as U.S. Exhibit 337, 2283. I quote from the last paragraph of page 1 of the English translation. Last paragraph of page 1. Quoting, "My Führer, when you, my Führer, ordered me in mid-April 1933 to take over the trade unions." By the way, I believe that's been read before. I beg your pardon. I'll omit that reading. I'll pass on over now to document 392 PS. Document 392, U.S. Exhibit 326. And I quote, beginning at the top of page, is it 11? I can't tell whether it's page 1 or 11 of the English translation. Page 1 of the English translation. On Tuesday, 2nd May, 1933, the coordination action of the free trade unions begins. The essential part of the action is to be directed against the General German Trade Union Federation and the General Independent Employees Federation. Anything beyond that which is dependent upon the free trade unions is left to the discretion of the Gauleiter's judgment. The Gauleiter are responsible for the execution of the coordination action in the individual areas. Supporters of the action should be members of the National Socialist Factory Sale organizations. SA as well as SS are to be employed for the occupation of the trade union property. That's been read, that particular paragraph. I omit that. I don't believe the next one has. The Gauleiter is to proceed with his measures on a basis of the closest understanding with the competent Gau or regional factory cell directors. In the Reich, the following will be occupied: the directing offices of the unions, and then it lists a number of offices. And I'd previously quoted who was to be taken into protective custody. The next provision: exceptions are granted only with the permission of the Gauleiter. It is understood that this action is to proceed in a strongly disciplined fashion. The Gauleiter are responsible in this respect. They are to hold the direction of the action firmly in hand. Heil Hitler, Dr. Robert Lye. The defendant Lye's order for the dissolution of the independent trade unions was carried out as planned and directed. Trade union premises all over Germany were occupied by the SA and the unions dissolved. On the 2nd of May, 1933, the official NSDAP press service reported that the National Socialist Factory Sales Organization, NSBO, had, quote, eliminated the old leadership of free trade unions, unquote, and taken over their leadership. I now offer in evidence document 2224, PS. 2224, U.S. Exhibit 364. This is an exhibit from the 1st and 2nd of May 1933 issues of the National Socialist Party Press Agency. And I quote from paragraph 5 of page 1 of the English translation. Quoting, National Socialism, which today has assumed leadership of the German working class, can no longer bear the responsibility for leaving the men and women of the German working class. Your Honor, it is 2224, page 1 of the English translation. The members of the largest trade organization in the world, the German trade union movement, in the hands of a people who do not know a fatherland that is called Germany. Because of that, the National Socialist Factory Sale Organization, NSBO, has taken over the leadership of the trade unions. The NSBO has eliminated the old leadership of the trade unions, of the General German Trade Unions League, and the General Independent Employees Federation. On 2nd May 1933, the National Socialist Factory Sale Organization, NSBO, took over the leadership of all trade unions. All trade union buildings were occupied, and most stringent control has been organized over financial and personnel matters of the organization. End of quote. As shown by this evidence, the assault on the independent unions directed the defendant Lye in his capacity as Reichsleiter in charge of the party organization, assisted by Gauleiter and party formations, which included the seizure of the trade union funds and property. In this connection, I offer in evidence document 1678 PS. 1678 PS. U.S. Exhibit 365. This document is a report of a speech by Reichsleiter Lai on the 11th of September 1937 to the 5th annual session of the German Labor Front. In this speech, Lai shamelessly corroborates the confiscation of the trade union funds. I quote from page 1 of the English translation, paragraph 4, quoting, "Once I said to the Führer, 'My Führer, actually I am standing with one foot in jail, for today I am still the trustee of comrades Leipart and Imbush, and should they someday ask me to return their money, then it will be found that I have spent it, either by building things or otherwise. But they shall never again find their property in the condition in which they handed it over to me. Therefore, I would have to be convicted.' The Führer laughed then and remarked that apparently I felt extremely well in this condition. It was very difficult for us all. Today we laugh about it." End of quotation. The plan of the Nazi conspirators to eliminate the free trade unions was advanced by the enactment on 19 May 1933 of a law which abolished collective bargaining between workers and employers and replaced it with a regulation of working conditions by labor trustees appointed by Hitler. I refer to document 405 PS, which is the text of the law, 1933 Reichsgesetzblatt 1, page 285. After providing in section 1 for the appointment by Hitler of the trustees of labor, the law provides, and I quote from section 2 of the English translation of document 405, quote, "Until a new revision of the social constitution, the trustees," it's document 405 PS, "the trustees are to regulate the conditions for the conclusion of labor contracts. This practice is to be legally binding for all persons and replaces the system founded on combinations of workers, of individual employers, or of combinations of employers." End of quotation. Having destroyed the independent unions and collective bargaining, the next step of the Nazi conspirators was to secure the Nazification of the field in industrial relations. I refer to document 1861 PS, which is the text of the law of 20 January 1934, 1934 Reichsgesetzblatt 1, page 45. This law was entitled "A Law Regulating National Labor," and it imposed the leadership principle upon industrial enterprisers and provided in section 1, paragraph 1, that the enterpriser should be the leader of the plant and the workers would constitute his followers. I now quote from section 1, paragraph 2 of the first page of document 1861. Number 1861. Quote, "The leader of the plant makes the decision for the employees and laborers in all matters concerning the enterprise as far as they are regulated by this law. He is responsible for the well-being of the employees and laborers. The employees and laborers owe him faithfulness according to the principles of the factory community." Unquote. The trade unions having been dissolved and the leadership principle superimposed upon the relationship of management and labor, the members of the leadership corps joined in and directed measures designed to replace the independent unions by the German Labor Front, the DAF, an affiliated party organization. On the very day the Nazi conspirators seized and dissolved the free trade unions, 2nd of May 1933, they publicly proclaimed that a united front of German workers would be formed with Hitler as honorary patron at a workers' congress on the 10th of May 1933. I quote from next to the last paragraph of page 2 of document 2224 PS. Page 2, next to the last paragraph, which was a release of the Nazi Party press agency. I quote, "The National Socialist Party press agency is informed that a great workers' congress will take place on Wednesday, 10th May, in the Prussian House of Lords in Berlin. The United Front of German workers will be formed there. Adolf Hitler will be asked to assume the position of honorary patron," unquote. The Nazi conspirators employed the German Labor Front, the DAF, as an instrument for propagandizing its millions of compulsory members with Nazi ideology. The control of the leadership corps over the German Labor Front was assured not only by the designation of Reichsleiter of the party organization Lai as head of the DAF, but by the employment of a large number of political leaders charged with disseminating and imposing Nazi ideology upon the large membership in the DAF. I now cite document 2271 PS, U.S. Exhibit 328, which is the party organization book referred to yesterday, pages 185 to 187. And I quote from the first page of the English translation, the first paragraph. I quote, "The National Socialist Factory Cells Organization, NSBO, is a union of the political leaders of the NSDAP and the German Labor Front. The NSBO is the carrier of the organization of the German Labor Front. The duties and responsibilities of the NSBO have passed over to the DAF. The political leaders who have been transferred from the NSBO to the German Labor Front guarantee the ideological education of the DAF in the spirit of the National Socialistic idea," unquote. Now, if Your Honor please, in addition to the evidence heretofore presented, the prosecution submits as another evidence of crime that the leadership corps of the NSDAP was responsible for the plundering of art treasures by defendant Reichsleiter Rosenberg's Einsatzstab Rosenberg. And the definition of Einsatzstab is a special staff, and I'm told that the word Einsatz means to give action to. In other words, it was a task force, a special staff. This subject, diverting from the text, had been prepared in connection with the general subject of plundering of art treasures, and I shall now turn to the document books of the plundering of art treasures, because the citations now will be in this small book.
Will this be
Your Honor.
book X or W?
Which
W, perhaps.
X,
Is it W or X?
W.
W.
I now pass to Your Honor's document book W. And may I say, diverting from the text, that the trial address, which is very brief, I'm told by the translating system, has been translated into all 4 languages. And as I understand, Colonel Dostaire will distribute them to all parties in their native language. Isn't that correct?
Very well.
Now, also by way of explanation, in the beginning, there's one reference here to the plundering of art treasures in the occupied portion of Poland, which does not bear directly upon this subject, but does on the general conspiracy. And I thought in the interest of time that we might follow the presentation because it's very brief. May it please the tribunal, the sections of the indictment which are to be proved at this point are those dealing with the plunder of public and private property. Under count 1, the common plan or conspiracy. It is not my purpose to explore all phases of the organized plunder in which the Germans engaged. However, I would bring to the attention of the tribunal and of the world the defendants' vast, organized, systematic program for the cultural impoverishment of virtually every community of Europe and for the enrichment of Germany thereby. Special emphasis will be placed on the activities of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. And the responsibility of the leadership corps in this regard is a responsibility that is shared by the defendants Rosenberg, Goering, and Keitel, and by the defendant organizations, the General Staff and High Command, the Gestapo, the Security Service, and the SS. Before I deal with the plunder of the cultural treasures by the Einsatzstab Rosenberg, I wish to reveal briefly the independent plundering operations conducted in the general government of occupied Poland by authority of the defendant Goering and under the supervision of defendant Frank, the Governor General. In October 1939, Goering issued a verbal order to a Dr. Mohlmann, asking him to undertake the immediate securing of all Polish art treasures. Dr. Mohlmann himself gives evidence of this order in document number 3042, found in the document book last introduced, as U.S. Exhibit 375. Here it is.
Are the documents in Book W?
Book W, yes, sir.
I was asking whether the documents in Book W are placed in order of number in PS.
They are, yes, sir.
Oh.
And the first one is found on the first page. I beg your pardon. Mr. Brudno tells me. 3042 would be a numerical order towards the end, Your Honor.
Yes.
3042. Did you find it?
I've got it. I was only asking for general information.
Yes, sir. They are consecutively. I would like to offer this affidavit and read it in full. It's short. It is obtained in Austria.
Yes.
Katjan Mohlmann states under oath, I have been a member of the NSDAP since 1 April 1938. I was Brigadier General, Oberfuhrer in the SS. I was never an illegal Nazi. I was the special deputy of the Governor General of Poland, Hans Frank, for the safeguarding of art treasures in the general government, October 1939 to September 1943. Goering, in his function as chairman of the Reich Defense Council, had commissioned me with this duty. I confirmed that it was the official policy of the Governor General, Hans Frank, to take into custody all imported art treasures which belong to Polish public institutions, private collections, and the church. I confirmed that the art treasures mentioned were actually confiscated, and it is clear to me that they would not have remained in Poland in case of a German victory, but they would have been used to complement German artistic property. Signed and sworn to by Dr. Mullman. On the 15th of November 1939, Frank issued a decree which is published officially in the law of the general government, and I ask the court to take judicial knowledge. It's page E800, Article 1, Section 1. It's not in the document book, it's just a short quotation which we ask the court to take judicial knowledge. Quoting, all movable and stationary property of the former Polish state will be sequestered for the purpose of securing all manner of public valuables, unquote. In a further decree of 16 December 1939, appearing at page E810 of the same publication, Frank provided that all art objects in public possession in the general government were to be seized for the fulfillment of public tasks of common interest, insofar as they had not already been seized under the decree of 13 November. The decree provided that in addition to art collections and art objects belonging to the Polish state, there will be considered as owned by the public those private collections which have not already been taken under protection by the special commissioner, as well as all ecclesiastical art property. On the 24th of September 1940, Frank decreed that all property seized on the basis of the decree of 15 November 1939 will be transferred to the ownership of the general government. And this decree is also found at page 810 of the same publication. It is impossible for me to furnish this tribunal a complete picture of the vastness of the program for the cultural impoverishment of Poland carried out pursuant to the directives, as I cannot read into the record the 500-odd masterpieces cataloged in document 1233 P.S., or the many hundreds of additional items. Now, document 1233, which I hold in my hand, is a finely bound, beautiful printed catalog in which the defendant Frank proudly lists and describes the major works of art which he had plundered for the benefit of the Reich. This volume was captured by the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Division of the 3rd United States Army and was found in Frank's home near Munich. The introductory page describes the thoroughness with which the general government stripped Poland of its cultural possessions. That's quoted on document 1233 P.S.
Will you hand that up?
Will you hand the book up? I'm quoting now from the introductory page. English translation, the first paragraph. I might say by way of explanation that lists all of the valuable art treasures, Mr. Willett.
Yes. Yes, Colonel Storey?
I just started to say this book lists the valuable art treasures by titles. I now quote from the introductory page. By reason of the decree of 16 December 1939, by the Governor General of the occupied Polish territories. The Special Commissioner for Securing Objects of Art and Culture was able to seize within 6 months almost all of the art objects of the country, with one exception, a series of Flemish gobelins of the Castle of Krakow. According to the latest information, these are now in France, so that subsequent seizure will be possible. Leafing through this catalog, we find that it included references to paintings by German, Italian, Dutch, French, and Spanish masters, rare illustrated books, Indian and Persian miniatures, woodcuts, the famous Weizstoss hand-carved altar, created here in Nuremberg and purchased for use in Poland, handicraft articles of gold and silver, antique articles of crystal, glass, and porcelain, tapestries, antique weapons, rare coins, and medals. These articles were seized, as indicated in the catalog, from public and private sources, including the National Museums in Krakow and Warsaw, the cathedrals of Warsaw and Lublin, a number of churches and monasteries, university libraries, and a great many private collections of Polish nobility. I wish now to offer in evidence the catalog bearing our number 1233 PS. It's the one just introduced in evidence. Bearing our number 1709 PS. This latter report, in addition to listing the 521 major items described in the catalog, lists many other items, though generally no less important from an artistic standpoint, and were considered by the Germans to be of secondary importance from the point of view of the Reich. It is interesting to know with what pains the defendant Frank attempted to conceal his real purpose in seizing these works of art. The cover of the catalog itself states that the objects listed were secured and safeguarded. Strangely enough, it was found necessary to safeguard some of the objects by transporting them to Berlin and depositing them in the depot of the special deputy or in the safe of the Dutch Reichsbank, as is indicated on page 80 of document 1709 PS, U.S. Exhibit 378. The items referred to as having been transported to Berlin are listed in the catalog of objects safeguarded, and then a number are listed in being numbers 4, 17, 27, 35, and so on. 31 extremely valuable and world-renowned sketches of Albrecht Dürer, taken from the collection of Lubomirski in Lemberg, were likewise safeguarded. At page 68 of this report, Dr. Mohlman states that he personally handed these sketches to Göring, who took them to the Führer at his headquarters. Numerous objects of art, painting, tapestries, plates, dishes, as well as other dinnerware were also safeguarded by Frank, who had the special deputy deliver these objects to an architect for the purpose of furnishing the castle at Krakow and the Schloss Kressendorf, which were the residences of the Governor General Frank. It was apparently Frank's belief that these items would be safer in his possession, used to grace his table and dazzle his guests, than they would be in the possession of the rightful owners. There is no doubt whatever that virtually the entire art possession of Poland was seized for the use of Germany and would never have been returned in the event of German victory. Dr. Mohlman, a noted German art authority who directed the seizure program for the period of 4 years and was endowed by Frank with sufficient authority to promulgate decrees generally applicable throughout the territory, has stated the objectives of the program in no uncertain terms in the affidavit which I have just referred to. So much for Poland. I now direct the attention of the tribunal to the activities of the Einsatzstab Rosenberg, an organization which planned and directed the looting of the cultural treasures of nearly all Europe. To obtain a full conception of the vastness of this looting program, it will be necessary to envision Europe as a treasure house in which is stored the major portion of the artistic and literary product of 2,000 years of Western civilization. It will further be necessary to envision the forcing of this treasure house by a horde of vandals, bent on systematically removing to the Reich these treasures, which are in a sense the heritage of all of us, to keep them there for the enjoyment and enlightenment of the Germans alone. Unique in history, this art seizure program staggers one's imagination and challenges one's credulity. The documents which I am about to offer in evidence will present undeniable proof of the execution of a policy to strip the occupied countries of the accumulated product of centuries of devotion to art and the pursuit of learning. And may I digress here a moment and state that we're not going to offer all the documents and all the details because our Soviet and French colleagues will offer a great many of the detailed documents in support of their case on war crimes. I now offer in evidence document 136 PS. 136 PS as U.S. Exhibit 367. And that is an order of Hitler dated the 29th of January 1940, which set into motion the art seizure program that was to envelop the continent. I now offer, here's the original. I call Your Honor's attention to this original being signed by Adolf Hitler, and I believe it is in the famous jumbo type. I quote the order in its entirety. It's very short. The Hohe Schule is supposed to become the center for national, socialistic, ideological, and educational research. It will be established after the conclusion of the war. I order that the already initiated preparations be continued by Reichsleiter Alfred Rosenberg, especially in the way of research and setting up of the library. All sections of the party and state are requested to cooperate with him in this task. Although the above order makes no specific mention of the seizure of art properties, by the 5th of November 1940, the program had extended beyond its original scope to include the seizure of Jewish art collections. I now offer in evidence document number 141 PS, which is a certified copy of an order signed by Goering, dated 5 November 1940, in which the defendant Goering states, and I quote, "In conveying the measures taken until now for the securing of Jewish art property by the chief of the military administration, Paris, and the Einsatzstab Rosenberg, the art objects brought to the Louvre will be disposed of in the following way. 1. Those art objects about which the Führer has reserved for himself the decision as to their use. 2. Those art objects which serve to the completion of the Reich Marshal's collection. 3. Those art objects and library books, the use of which useful to the establishment of the higher institutes of learning, and which come within the jurisdiction of Reichsleiter Rosenberg. Those art objects which are suited to be sent to the German museums. Thus, early in 1940, 11 months after the initiation of the program for establishment of the Library for Ideological Research, The original purpose had been expanded so as to include the seizure of artworks not only for the benefit of research, but for the delectation of the Führer and Goering and the enhancement of the collections of German museums. Impelled as they were by perfidious dream of subjugating a continent, the Nazi conspirators could not content themselves merely with the exploitation of the cultural riches of France and rapidly extended their activities to the other occupied countries. I now offer in evidence document 137 PS. 137. That is a copy of an order signed by the defendant Keitel, dated 5th of July, 1940. I should like to read that brief order in full. To the Chief of the Army High Command, Chief of the Armed Forces in the Netherlands, Reichsleiter Rosenberg suggested to the Führer that, 1, the state libraries and archives be searched for documents valuable to Germany. 2, the chancelleries of the high church authorities and lodges be searched for political maneuvers directed against us, and that the material in question be seized. The Führer has ordered that this suggestion be followed and that the Gestapo, supported by the archivist of Reichsleiter Rosenberg, be put in charge of the researches. The Chief of Security Police, SS Gruppenführer Heydrich, has been informed. He will communicate with the competent military commanders in order to execute this order. These measures will be executed in all regions of the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France occupied by us. It is requested that subordinate services be informed. Chief of the Army High Command, signed Keitel. From the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, the Einsatzstab's activities ultimately were expanded still further to Norway and Denmark. I now offer in evidence document 159 PS, U.S. Exhibit 380, which is the copy of an order signed by Udikal. That's 159 PS. Copy of an order signed by Udikal, Chief of the Einsatzstab, dated the 6th of June, 1944, from which it is seen that a special mission of the Einsatzstab was sent to Norway and Denmark. As the German army penetrated to the east, the fingers of the Einsatzstab reached out to seize the cultural riches thus made available to them, and their activities were extended to the occupied eastern territories, including the Baltic states and the Ukraine, as well as to Hungary and Greece. I now offer in evidence document 153 PS, U.S. Exhibit 381. 153. Being a certified copy of a letter from Rosenberg, the Reich Commissioner for the East and Reich Commissioner for the Ukraine, dated 27 April 1942. The subject of the letter is stated to be as follows: formation of a central unit for the seizure and securing of objects of cultural value in the occupied Eastern Territory. In the last paragraph of that document, I quote, "With the commissars of the Reich, a special department within Department 2, Political, has been set up for a limited time for the seizure and securing of objects of cultural value. This office is under the control of the head of the main group of Einsatzstab of Reichsleiter Rosenberg for the occupied country," unquote. Activities, John?
Perhaps that'd be a good time to break off 10 minutes.
Tribunal, please. activities were initiated in Hungary as indicated by document 158 PS, U.S. Exhibit 382, which I now offer in evidence. Document 158. This was a copy of a message initialed by Udikal, Rosenberg's chief of staff. The first paragraph states, quote, "The Einsatzstab of Reichsleiter Rosenberg for the occupied territories has dispatched a Sonderkommando under the direction of Stab-Einsatzführer Dr. Zeiss, who is identified by means of his service book number 187 for the accomplishment of the missions of the Einsatzstab in Hungary described in the Führer's decree of 1 March 1942, unquote. I now offer in evidence document 171 PS, U.S. Exhibit 383, which is a report on, quote, library for exploitation of the Jewish question, unquote. And I quote from 5th paragraph of document 171 PS. Quote, "The most significant book collections today belonging to the stock of the library for exploration of the Jewish question are the following," unquote. The 9th item of the list, which follows, refers to, quote, book collections from Jewish communities in Greece, about 10,000 volumes. It was only natural that an operation conducted on so vast a scale, extending as it did to France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, Eastern occupied countries, Baltic states, the Ukraine, Hungary, and Greece, should call upon a multitude of other agencies for assistance. Among the other agencies cooperating in the plunder program were several of those which stand indicted here as criminal organizations. The cooperation of the Wehrmacht High Command was demanded by the Hitler order of 1 March 1942, and I offer in evidence as our document 149 PS, Exhibit 369, which is signed personally by Adolf Hitler and is also on the jumbo type. The order decrees the ideological fight against the enemies of National Socialism to be a military necessity and reaffirms the authority of the Einsatzstab Rosenberg to conduct searches and seizures of suitable material for the Hohe Schule. The 5th paragraph states, and I quote, "The measures of execution concerning the cooperation of the Wehrmacht are assured by the chief of the OKW with the consent of Reichsleiter Rosenberg." And while I'm on that document, it's referred to later, I should like to read the other portions. I call attention of your honors to the distribution. It's distributed to all duty stations of the armed forces, the party, and the state. Says Jews, Freemasons, and their associated ideological enemies of National Socialism are responsible for the war which is now being waged against the Reich. The coordinated ideological fight against those powers is a military necessity. I therefore charge Reichsleiter Rosenberg to carry out this task in cooperation with the chief of the OKW. His staff for special purposes in the occupied territories is authorized to search libraries, record offices, lodges, and other ideological and cultural institutions of all kinds for suitable material and to confiscate the said material for the ideological task of the NSDAP and the later scientific researches of the Hohe Schule. The same regulation applies to the cultural values which are in the possession of Jews, ownerless or not, of unobjectionable origin. And then I've already quoted the other. The final passage is, the necessary measures within the territories of the East under the German administration are determined by Reichsleiter Rosenberg in his capacity as Reich Minister for the occupied territories of the East, signed by Adolf Hitler.
Colonel Storey,
Yes, sir.
I think the tribunal would find it convenient and that it would save time if documents, when they are referred to, were read in full insofar as you want to read them, rather than reading one passage and then returning to a document later on.
Yes, sir. May I explain why that was, sir? I was trying to fit in this presentation with the leadership corps, and it was quoted in two places, and I never noticed it until I'd started.
Well, but what I'm saying is that I think it's much more easy to follow the documents
Yes,
if
sir.
all the parts of the document which you want to read are read at one time, rather than that you should read
Yes, sir.
one sentence, then come back to another sentence, and then possibly come back to a document for a third sentence.
Yes, sir.
I don't know whether it would be possible for you to do that.
Well,
but-
we'll try to work it
Yeah.
out that way, sir. Thank you.
And would you also read a little bit more slowly?
Thank you, sir. Cooperation of the SS and the SD is indicated in a letter from Rosenberg to Bormann, dated 23rd of April, 1941, which is document 071 PS, U.S. Exhibit 371, which I now offer in evidence. I quote in the fifth sentence of the first numbered paragraph as follows. It is understood that the confiscations are not executed by the regional authorities, but that this is conducted by the Security Service, SD, as well as by the police. Further down in the same paragraph, it is stated, quote, it has been communicated to me in writing by the Gauleiter that the chief office of the RSHA, Reich Security, of the SS, has claimed the following from the library of a monastery: the Catholic Handbook, Albertus Magnus, edition of the Church Fathers, History of the Papacy by Pastor, and other works. In the second and last paragraph, it is stated, quote, I should like to remark in this connection that this affair has already been executed on our side with Security Service, SD, in the most loyal fashion. Unquote. The defendant Goering was especially diligent in furthering the purposes of the Einsatzstab Rosenberg, a diligence which will be readily understood in view of the fact that he himself directed that second in priority only to the demands of the Führer were to be those art objects which served the completion of the Reich Marschall's collection, that is Goering. On May 1, 1941, Goering issued an order to all party, state, and Wehrmacht services, which I now offer in evidence as document 1117 PS, 117 PS, U.S. Exhibit 384. That is an original signed by Goering. This requested all party, state, and Wehrmacht services, and I quote from it, to give all possible support and assistance to the Chief of Staff of Reichsleiter Rosenberg's staff. The above-mentioned persons are requested to report to me on their work, particularly on any difficulties which might arise, unquote. On the 30th of May, 1942, Goering claimed credit for a large degree of success of the Einsatzstab. I now offer into evidence a captured photostatic copy of a letter from Goering to Rosenberg with Goering's signature, which bears our number 1015I-PS. which I offer in evidence as U.S. Exhibit 385. The last paragraph of that letter, 1015I P.S. It's on page 1 of the English translation. On the other hand, I also support personally the work of the Einsatzstab wherever I can do so. And a great part of the seized cultural goods can be accounted for because I was able to assist the Einsatzstab with my organizations, unquote. If I have tried the patience of the tribunal in connection with describing the origin, growth, and operation of the art looting collection and organization, it is because I feel that it would be impossible for me to convey to you a full conception as to the magnitude of the plunder without conveying to you first information as to the vast organizational work that was necessary in order to enable the defendants to collect in Germany cultural treasures of staggering proportion. Nothing of value was safe from the grasp of the Einsatzstab. In view of the great experience of the Einsatzstab in the complex business of organized plunder of a continent, its facilities were well suited to the looting of material other than cultural objects. Thus, when Rosenberg required equipment for the furnishing of the offices of the administration in the East, his Einsatzstab was pressed into action to confiscate Jewish homes in the West. Document number L188, which is U.S. Exhibit 386, I offer in evidence as a copy of a report submitted by the director of Rosenberg's Office West, operating under the Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories. I wish to quote at some length from this document, and I call the tribunal's attention to the third paragraph on page 3 of the translation. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg was charged with the carrying out of this task, that is, the seizure of art properties. In addition to this seizure of property, at the suggestion of the Director West of the Special Section of Einsatzstab, it was proposed to the Reichsleiter that the furniture and other contents of the unguarded Jewish home should also be secured and dispatched to the Minister for the Eastern Occupied Territories for the use in the Eastern Territories. Then the last paragraph on the same page, quote, at first all the confiscated furniture and goods were dispatched to administration of the occupied Eastern Territories. Owing to the terror attacks on German cities which then began, and in the knowledge that the bombed out people in Germany ought to have preference over the Eastern people, Reich Minister and Reichsleiter Rosenberg obtained a new order from the Führer, according to which the furniture, etc., obtained through the action was to be put at the disposal of the bombed out people within Germany, unquote. The report continues with a description of the efficient methods employed in looting the Jewish homes in the West. Top of page 4 of the English translation, I next quote. The confiscation of Jewish homes was carried out as follows. So-called confiscation officials went from house to house, where no records were available of the addresses of Jews who had departed or fled, as was the case, for instance, in Paris, in order to collect information as to abandoned Jewish homes. They drew up inventories of those homes and subsequently sealed them. In Paris alone, about 20 confiscation officials confiscated more than 38,000 homes. The transportation of the contents of these homes was completed with the entire car park of the Union of Parisian Removal Contractors, who had to provide up to 150 trucks, 12 to 1,500 French laborers. If Your Honor, please, I'm omitting the rest of the details of that report because our French colleagues will present the details later. Looting on such a scale seems fantastic, but I feel I must refer to another statement. For though the seizure of the contents of over 71,000 homes and their shipment to the Reich in upwards of 26,000 railroad cars is by no means a petty operation, quantities of plundered art, treasures, and books, and their incalculable value as revealed in the documents I am about to offer, will make these figures dwindle by comparison. I next refer to the stacks of leather-bound volumes in front of me, some of them are here, to which the Justice referred in his opening statement. These 39 volumes, which are before me, contain photographs of works of art secured by the Einsatzstab and are volumes which were prepared by members of the Rosenberg staff. All of these volumes bear our number 2522 PS, and I offer them in evidence. I'm passing to Your Honors 8 of these volumes so that each one of you, they're all different, but so that each one of you might see a sample of the inventory. I call Your Honor's attention to the inside cover page. Most of them have an inventory in German of the contents of the book, and then follows a true photograph of each one of these priceless objects of art separated by fine tissue paper. There are 39 of these volumes that were captured by our forces when they overran a part of southern occupied German area. Before referring to these volumes again...
Is anything known about the articles themselves?
Beg your pardon, sir?
Is anything known about the articles here photographed themselves?
Yes, sir. I will describe them later. And if Your Honor please, I believe each one of them is identified in addition to the inventory.
Oh, I didn't mean that. I meant whether the article, it's a piece of furniture or picture itself, had been found.
Yes, sir. They were found. They were found in a hidden, found in an underground cavern. They were found in an underground cavern, most of them, in, I believe, the southern part of Bavaria. And these books were found by our staff in connection with the group of U.S. Army people who have assembled these objects of art and are now in the process of returning them to the rightful owners. That's where we got those books. I should like to refer to, while Your Honors are looking at these, to just the aggregate totals of the different paintings. Here are the totals as shown by document 1015B PS, which is in the document book, 1015 little b PS. And as there are totals, I don't think Your Honors need to follow the document, and you can continue looking at the books if you'd like. Up to the 15th of July, 1944, the following had been scientifically inventoried: 21,903 pieces of art. These included 5,281 paintings, pastels, watercolors, and drawings, 684 miniatures, glass and enamel paintings, books and manuscripts. Here are 2,477 articles of furniture of value to art history. Some of your honors have volumes showing those antique articles of furniture. Here's another one, 5,825 handmade artworks, porcelains, bronze, ceramics, jewelry, etc. 1,286 East Asiatic artworks, and they were in the bronze, the plastic, or the porcelain. 259 artworks of antiquity, such as sculptures, vases, jewelry, cut stones, etc. The mere statement that 21,903 artworks have been seized does not furnish an adequate conception of their value. I refer again to the statement in the document just quoted, quote, that the extraordinary artistic and material value of the seized artworks cannot be expressed in figures, unquote, and that they are objects of such a unique character that their valuation is entirely impossible. These 39 volumes are by no means a complete catalog. They present at most pictures of about 2,500 of the art objects seized. And I ask you to imagine that this catalog had been completed, and in the place of 39 volumes, we had 350 to 400 volumes. In other words, if they were prepared in inventory form as these 39 volumes, to cover all of them, it would take 350 to 400 volumes. I now offer we had arranged, Your Honor, to project just a few of these on the screen, but before we do that, which is the end of this part of the presentation, I should like to call Your Honor's attention to document 015 PS. It's dated April the 16th, 1943. It's a copy of a letter from Rosenberg to Hitler. The occasion for the writing of this letter was the birthday of the Führer, to commemorate which Rosenberg presented some folders of photographs and pictures seized by the Einsatzstab. And I imagine, although we have no authentic evidence, that probably some of these were prepared for that occasion. In the closing paragraph of the letter, document 015 PS, he says, "I beg of you, my Führer, to give me a chance during my next audience to report to you orally on the whole extent and scope of this art seizure action. I beg you to accept a short written intermediate report of the progress and the extent of the art seizure action, which will be used as a basis for this later oral report, and also accept 3 copies of the temporary picture catalogs, which too only show a part of the collection you own. I shall deliver further catalogs which are now being compiled when they are finished." Rosenberg then closes with this touching tribute to the aesthetic tastes of the Führer, tastes which were satisfied at the expense of a continent, and I quote, "I shall take the liberty during the requested audience to give you, my Führer, another 20 folders of pictures, with the hope that this short occupation with the beautiful things of art which are nearest to your heart will send a ray of beauty and joy into your revered life." Unquote. Just a moment, sir. These photos represent an addition to the collection of 53 of the most valuable objects of art delivered some time ago to your collection. This folder also shows only a small percentage of the exceptional worth and extent of these objects of art seized by my service command, Dienststelle, in France, and put into a safe place on the Reich. Thank you, sir. If Your Honor, please, at this time, we would like to project on the screen a few of these photographs. The photographs of paintings which we are now about to project on the screen are taken from a single volume of the catalog and are merely representative of many volumes of the pictures of similar works. The other items, photos of which are to be projected, were picked from various volumes on special subjects. For example, the Gobelin tapestry, which you're about to see, is merely one picture from an entire volume of tapestry illustrations. Each picture that you will see is representative of a number of volumes of similar pictures, and each volume from which these single pictures were taken represents approximately a tenth of the total number of volumes which would be necessary to illustrate all the items actually plundered by the Einsatzstab. We'll now have the slides, just a few of them. This first picture is a portrait of a woman painted by the Italian painter Palma Vecchio. All right, next. This next picture is a portrait of a woman by the Spanish painter Velázquez. This picture is a portrait of Lady Spencer by the English painter Sir Joshua Reynolds. This picture is a painting by the French painter Watteau. This is a painting of the Three Graces by Rubens. This is a portrait of an old woman by the famous painter Rembrandt. This painting of a young woman is by the Dutch painter Van Dyck. Now this picture is a sample of 16th century jewelry in gold and enamel decorated with pearls. This is a 17th century Gobelin tapestry. This picture is of a Japanese painting from the catalog volume on East Asiatic art. This is an example of famous China. This is a picture of a silver inlaid Louis XIV cabinet. The last picture is of a silver altar piece of the 15th or 16th century of Spanish origin. That's the last picture. The lights, please. I call your attention again that each of the pictures you have just seen is merely representative of a large number of similar items illustrated in the 39-volume catalog, which is in itself only partially complete. There is little wonder that the Führer's occupation with these beautiful things of art, which were nearest to his heart, should have sent a ray of beauty and joy into his revered life. I doubt that any museum in the world, whether the Metropolitan in New York, the British Museum in London, the Louvre in Paris, or the famous Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, could present such a catalog as this. In fact, should they pool their treasures, the result would certainly fall short of the art collection that Germany amassed for itself at the expense of the other nations of Europe. Never in history has a collection so great been amassed with so little scruple. It is refreshing, however, to know that the victorious Allied armies have recovered most of such treasuries, principally hidden away in salt mines, tunnels, and secluded castles, and the proper governmental agencies are now in the process of restoring these priceless works of art to their rightful owners. I shall next refer to document 154 PS. Which is a letter dated 5th of July 1942 from Dr. Lammers, Reich Minister and Chief of the Chancellery, to the highest Reich authorities and services directly subordinate to the Führer. This letter restates and implements the Hitler order that was introduced in evidence and explains that the Führer delegated authority to Rosenberg's staff to search for and seize cultural property by virtue of Reichsleiter Rosenberg's position as representative of the Führer for the supervision of the whole ideological and political education of the NSDAP. The tribunal will recall, however, that it is by virtue of holding this office that Defendant Rosenberg occupied a place within the Reichsleitung, or party directorate of the Leadership Corps. That's U.S. Exhibit 370, and it is simply offered for the purpose of showing the address to the highest Reich authorities and services directly subordinate to the Führer. In a letter to the defendant Bormann, dated the 23rd of April, 1941, the defendant Rosenberg protested against the arbitrary removal by the SD and other public services of property from libraries, monasteries, and other institutions. And he proposed that in the claims by the SD and his representative, the final regulation as to the confiscation should be made by the Gauleiter. This letter has been offered previously as 071 PS. and I quote beginning with next to the last sentence at the bottom of page 1 of the English translation. I'm sorry, Your Honor, that is in the other book, and it's in that big book. I'm sorry, this refers to the big book. And
You cited 071 this morning.
Sir? Yes, sir, and I'll forego that at the moment, Your Honor, because it refers back to the other book. Finally, in connection with the presentation of this subject, I submit that the summary of evidence establishes that the defendants and their conspirators, Rosenberg and Bormann, acting in their capacity as political leaders of the leadership corps of the Nazi Party and as members thereof, participated in the conspiracy or common plan alleged in count 1 of the indictment and committed acts constituting the crimes alleged. Accordingly, we submit 1, the leadership corps of the Nazi Party is a group or organization in the sense in which those terms are used in Article 9 of the Charter. 2, the defendants and conspirators, Rosenberg and Bormann, committed the crimes defined in Article 6 of the Charter and in their capacity as members of the political leaders of the leadership corps of the Nazi Party. It was at all times the primary and central design and purpose of the leadership corps of the Nazi Party to direct, engage, and participate in the execution of the conspiracy which contemplated and involved the commission of the crimes as defined in Article 6 of the Charter. And I should like now to call attention again to a chart which was identified in the beginning, I believe, by Major Wallace, and it is taken from the book, The Face of the Party. It's taken from the publication which is entitled The Face of the Party. And this chart emphasizes, clearer than I can state, the total and thorough control over the life of the German, beginning at the age of 10 at the bottom of the chart and continuing through the various categories on up through. You notice the age of 10 to 14, the young folk, and then goes to the Adolf Hitler School on the right, 12 to 18. The Hitler Jugend, 15 to 18. The SA, the NSKK, the SS, the NSFK, the NSFK, 19 to 20. And then the labor services over at the left. And then again to the SA, the SS, NSKK, NSFK. And then into the Wehrmacht. And on up through to the top box on the left of the top row of men, the political leaders of the NSDAP. And then finally all of those buildings up there, as I understand, are the academies of the NSDAP. And then finally at the top, to the political leaders of the German folk, showing the evolution. This is the final exhibit, and with that I close the presentation of the Leadership Corps. And the next presentation is the Reich Cabinet, the Reich Regierung. Take just a few moments, 3 or 4 moments.
see your book, please, sir?
Yes.
Your Honor, please, there's one thing Colonel C. called my attention to. I simply refer to it for the record. In one of the previous documents, 090 PS, which is in the other document book, there was a statement that clearly established that the expenses of the Einsatzstab Rosenberg, that is, the staff's operational expenses, were financed by the Nazi Party. Document 090 PS, which is already in evidence and which I overlooked mentioning. The tribunal, please. I now offer document book X, which I believe has been passed to your honors. And also, we have prepared also, Colonel Dostaire's staff has prepared a chart of the Reichsregierung in different languages, and I believe your honors have copies. There's one copy here in German that I shall be glad to pass to counsel who are especially concerned with this case. They have one copy in German. I don't know who it is.
You mean counsel for the Reich Cabinet?
Yes, sir. May I say also, by preliminary reference, that we examined the records in the clerk's office this morning, and only one letter of intervention has been filed in behalf of the Reich Cabinet, and that was by the defendant Keitel. As I understand, only one has been filed, and that was by the defendant Keitel. We will now consider the Reich Regierung. Some preliminary remarks about this group have already been placed before the tribunal by Mr. Albright in his comment upon the government chart. It will be necessary, however, for the sake of coherence, to repeat briefly some of the statements made by him, and we therefore beg the indulgence of the tribunal. The Reich Regierung, meaning Reich Cabinet, unlike most of the other groups named in the indictment, was not especially created by the Nazi Party to carry out or implement its nefarious schemes and purposes. The Reich Regierung, commonly referred to as the Cabinet, had, before the Nazis came to power, a place in the constitutional and political history of the country. As with other cabinets of duly constituted governments, the executive power of the realm was concentrated in that body. The Nazi conspirators realized this only too well. Their aim for totalitarian control over the state could not be secured, they realized, except by acquiring, holding, and utilizing the top-level machinery of the state. And this they did. Under the Nazi regime, the Reich Regierung gradually became a primary agent of the Nazi Party, with functions and policies formulated in accordance with the objectives and methods of the party itself. The institution of the Reich Regierung became, at first gradually, and then with more rapidity, polluted by the infusion of the Nazi conspirators into the cabinet. Many of them, 16 to be exact, sit before you today in the dock. There was no plan, scheme, or purpose, however vile or inhuman or illegal in any sense of the word, that was not clothed with the semblance of legality by the Nazi Reich Regierung. It is for that reason that we will ask this tribunal, after the proof has been offered, to declare that that body, as defined in the indictment, to be a criminal organization. The proof will be divided into two main categories, the first of which will tend to establish the composition and nature of the Reich Regierung under the Nazis, as well as delineating briefly its functions and powers, while the second will tend to establish, and conclusively, we believe, the reasons why the brand of criminality should be affixed to that group. The term Reich Regierung, literally translated, reads Reich government. Actually, as we said, it was commonly taken to refer to the ordinary Reich Cabinet. In the indictment, the term Reich Regierung is defined to include not only those persons who were members of the ordinary Reich Cabinet, but also persons who were members of the Council of Ministers for the Defense of the Reich and the Secret Cabinet Council. However, the really important subdivision of the three is, as the proof will show, the ordinary cabinet. Between it and the other two, there was in reality only an artificial distinction. There existed, in fact, a unity of personnel, action, functions, and purpose that obliterated any academic separation. As used in the indictment, the term ordinary cabinet means Reich ministers, that is, heads of departments of the central government. Reich ministers without portfolio, state ministers acting as Reich ministers, and other officials entitled to take part in meetings. I might state here that altogether there were 48 persons who held positions in the ordinary cabinet. 17 of them are defendants before the tribunal. Borman is absent. Of the remaining 31, 8 are believed to be dead. Into the ordinary cabinet were placed the leading Nazi collaborators, the trusted henchmen, and then, when new governmental agencies or bodies were created, either by Hitler or the cabinet itself, the constituents of these new bodies were taken from the rolls of the ordinary cabinet. In 1933, when the first Hitler cabinet was formed on 30th of January, there were 10 ministries that could be classified as departments of the central government. I have here a typed copy of the minutes of the first meeting of that cabinet. These were found in the files of the Reich Chancellery and bear the typed signature of one Weinstein, who was described in the minutes as responsible for the protocol, the counselor of the ministry. That document already appears in document B, but I again refer the tribunal to page 4 of the translation, which is document 351 as shown in your document book, and contains a list of those present.
351 PS, you mean?
Yes, sir. 351 PS. U.S. Exhibit 389. The 10 ministers referred to therein are set forth. They are, and I read, quoting, Reich Minister of Foreign Affairs, the defendant von Neurath; Reich Minister of the Interior, the defendant Frick; Reich Minister of Finance, von Krozik; Reich Minister of Economy, and then I skip to the bottom of the page, Reich Minister of Food and Agriculture, Dr. Hugenberg; Reich Minister of Labor, Solte; Reich Minister of Justice, no name given. The post was filled 2 days later by Gertner. Reich Defense Minister von Blumberg, and the Reich Postmaster General and Reich Minister for Transportation, von Els Rubinat. In addition, you will note that the defendant Goering was there as Reich Minister. He had no portfolio then, and as Reich Commissar for Aviation. Dr. Parecki was there as Reich Commissar for Procurement of Labor. 2 state secretaries were present, Dr. Lammers of the Reich Chancellery and Dr. Meissner of the Reich Presidential Chancellery.
In the copy that I've got, the defendant Goering appears as the Reich Minister for Aviation.
Yes, sir. I mentioned that he appears as Reich Minister and as Reich Commissar for Aviation.
Well, I don't see that, do you?
Yes, that's what I know. No, it's a different page. This is the one.
Oh, I see.
It's a different page.
I was reading from the first 2 pages of the document.
That's the one he's reading from.
You were reading from page 4.
Yes, sir.
Very well.
I'm informed that the minister was created later, but he was the Reich Commissar for Aviation.
31, 33 was Minister. 533 when he was appointed.
In addition, the defendant Funk was present as Reich Press Chief, and the defendant von Poppen was present as deputy of the Reich Chancellor and Reich Commissar for the state of Prussia. It was not long after that date that new ministries or departments were created into which leading Nazi figures were placed. On the 13th of March, 1933, the Ministry of Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda was created, as shown in 1933 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 104, and it's our document 2029 PS. And I assume that the court will take judicial notice of the laws and decrees as we've mentioned in the previous proceedings. The late Goebbels was named as Reich Minister of Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda. On the 5th of May, 1933, the Ministry of Air, our document 2089 PS, Reichsgesetzblatt 1933, Part 1, page 241, and on the 1st of May, 1934, the Ministry of Education.
No, I don't think so. He's reciting.
Refer to 1934 Reichsgesetzblatt, page 365, Part 1, our document 2078 PS. On the 16th of July, 1935, the Ministry for Church Affairs, 1935 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 1029. Our document 2090 PS were created. The defendant Goering was made Air Minister. Bernhard Rust, Gauleiter of South Hanover, was named Education Minister, and Hans Kerl named Minister for Church Affairs. Two ministries were added after the war started. On 17 March 1940, the Ministry of Armaments and Munitions was established. Shown in 1940 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 513, our document 2091 PS. The late Dr. Tott, a high party official, was appointed to this post. The defendant Spear succeeded him. The name of this department was changed to Armaments and War Production in 1943. Citing 1943 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 529, in our document 2092 PS. On 17 July 1941, when the seizure of the Eastern Territories was in progress, the Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories was created. The decree appointing the defendant Rosenberg to the post of Minister of this department has already been received in evidence as USA Exhibit 319. During the years 1933 to 1945, one ministry was dropped, that of Defense, later called War. This took place in 1938 when on 4 February, Hitler took over command of the whole armed forces. At the same time, he created the chief of the supreme command of the armed forces, or in other words, the chief of the OKW. This was the defendant Keitel. The decree accomplishing this change is published in 1938, Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 111. It appears in our document book as 1915 PS. 1915 PS, and I'd like to quote a brief portion of that decree. 1915 PS. It begins at the bottom of the second paragraph. He, referring to the chief of the command of the armed forces, is in equal rank to a Reich Minister. At the same time, the Supreme Command takes the responsibility for the affairs of the Reich Ministry of War, and by my order, the Chief of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces exercises the authority formerly belonging to the Reich Minister. Another change in the composition of the cabinet during the years in question should be noticed. The post of Vice Chancellor was never refilled after the defendant von Papen left on 30 July 1934. In addition to the heads of the departments that I have outlined, the ordinary cabinet also contained Reich ministers without portfolio. Among these were the defendants Hans Frank, Seyss-Inquart, Schacht after he left the economics ministry, von Neurath after he was replaced as Minister of the Interior. There were other positions that were also an integral part of the cabinet. These were the Deputy of the Führer, the defendant Hess, and later his successor, the leader of the party chancellery, the defendant Bormann, the Chief of Staff of the SA, Ernest Röhm, for 7 months prior to his assassination, the Chief of the Reich Chancellery, Lammers, and as we have already referred, the Chief of the OKW, the defendant Keitel. These men had either, number 9, these men had either the title of or the rank of Reich Minister. I have already read portions of the law creating the Chief of the OKW, where his importance in the cabinet affairs is delineated. The importance of the defendants Hess and Bormann will soon be shown, while that of Chief of the Reich Chancellery, Lammers, will also soon become self-evident. But there were others, such as state ministers acting as Reich ministers. Only 2 persons fell within this category: the Chief of the Presidential Chancellery, Otto Meissner, and the State Minister of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, Karl Hans Frank. In addition, the indictment names as belonging to the ordinary cabinet others entitled to take part in the cabinet meetings. Many governmental agencies were created by the Nazis between the years 1933 and 1945. But the peculiarity of such creations was that in most instances, such new posts were given the right to participate in cabinet meetings. Here, the list is long but significant. Thus, those entitled to take part in cabinet meetings were the Commanders-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, the Reich Forest Master, the Inspector General for Water and Power, the Inspector General of German Roads, the Reich Labor Leader, the Reich Youth Leader, the Chief of the Foreign Organization in Foreign Affairs, the Chief of the Foreign Organization in the Foreign Office, the Reichsführer SS, and the Chief of the German Police in the Reich Ministry of the Interior, the Prussian Finance Minister, and the Cabinet Press Chief. These, then, were the posts and some of the personnel in the ordinary cabinet. They were all positions of such common knowledge and notoriety that the tribunal can take judicial notice. Further, they all appear on the chart entitled Organization of the Reich Government, which was authenticated by the defendant Frick and is in evidence as USA Exhibit 3, which Mr. Albrecht introduced on the second day of the trial. They are also provable by laws and decrees published in the Reichsgesetzblatt and by notices in the semi-official publication entitled Das Archiv, which is edited by an official of the Ministry of Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda, all of which, I submit, are within the judicial notice purview of the tribunal. The persons who held these posts in the ordinary cabinet varied between the years 1943 and 1945. Does Your Honor want to adjourn at 12:45?
Oh, well, yes, perhaps we had better, yes. 2 o'clock.